G'day and belated welcome to Saturday Sessions. We've got just the two of us tonight, Eric and myself. And I've been away for a few days and I carefully powered my machine off while I was away, and it decided to punish me for powering it off and send me into half an hour of debugging mode. So we're here. It's going to be kind of weird, just the two of us.
In a minute. It's like back to some of the pre-conversations before we even started the streaming thing.
Seriously. So, well, let's get the ball rolling in our usual way. What's your highlight of this week, Eric?
Well, personally, easy answer. Chelsea has returned from her journeys around the South Pacific and is back in Mexico and displaying all of the, let's call them adorable behaviors of jet lag. As one resets one's clock and goes to bed at 7 p.m. and gets up at 1 a.m.
Okay,
I think this morning is the first day I've been up at the same time
right.
since she's returned. Professionally, it's been an interesting week of bringing focus back to developing the content for the Leading Effective Agile Change program, and kind of having stepped away and worked on a couple other things for a few weeks, and coming back to it and building what amounts to not let's call it a non-traditionally formed Kanban. A color bond might be a better term.
Yeah.
A big grid of all the stuff that needs done and colors to focus my attention, and really just enjoying engaging with the material, having done a bunch of coaches on the couch and streams and things like that in the meantime, and the different discipline of bringing focus to one topic
Yeah.
is really what's shifting for me, and it's easier again. It's become easy because of the practice in all the other realms, and it just reminds me, like, many of these things are disciplines. They're actively things you have to
Oh,
practice and
seriously.
build discipline based on our conversations around personal mastery and the fifth discipline.
Yeah.
What about you?
Uh,
You've got some big news.
Look, I'm going to start with personal highlights as well, because to be honest, personal highlight for the week for me was easy. It was a daughter on the beach. Oh, sorry, a day on the beach with my daughter Sammy today. Uh, we still get to see her at least usually every month. Either she visits home or I visit Sydney. But it's just lovely to have time together and body surfing, and right now I'm paying the price for being irresponsible with sunscreen and glowing a little bit. But
Ah,
that's a beautiful way to spend the
you're supposed to blame the camera.
day.
Clearly, there's system issues.
No, I got home to my wife laughing at me quite a bit uh, about my bad habits with sunscreen. So that was a beautiful end. The week itself was awesome creatively and professionally. Sort of the first trial run of the MVP of my new sort of personally developed product owner, product manager course. And it was probably the most sustained creative pitch getting it finished that I've had in a very, very long time. I felt great about it when I finished it, and I felt even better about it after I finished delivering it. It was just really, really good conversations and good feedback. Came back with some really easily actionable tweaks in terms of just probably timing balance, but it was great fun.
So, it's sounds great. Watched your creative cycle go, and it leads me to wonder, though, is there a conversation to be had about the nature of deadlines and how we kind of poo-poo them in the agile community, but they're indisputable as far as their impact.
Look, I love to talk about student syndrome when I'm teaching. And then,
Hmm.
there's a quote, we chatted last week about that book, The Knowledge Creating Company. And, it's been 20 years since I read it, but there's a quote that always lived with me, which is, there's nothing like standing on the edge of a cliff to trigger your creativity. And
Hmm.
I have a habit, I cook on stuff, right? It gets in the back of my head, it spins round. I built the outline for it a month ago in a Miro, and it cooked and it cooked and it cooked, but then it was so much fun just being in flow.
Hmm.
And maybe it's unhealthy, and maybe night after night of 3 hours sleep had my wife talking about it being unhealthy. But it's also just hugely energetic. So who knows?
Hard to say.
It is. I've also found though, and like you, I think a whole bunch of the reflections and habits we've been building over the last little while in our conversations, our streams, our Fifth Discipline Book Club, watching your coach on the couches and the habits you've been building there, I felt them coming really strongly while I was putting the content together. There was a different set of thoughts in my head as I was processing it.
Is it worth digging in today to what those different thoughts are in the tone and things like that? So if we're both having similar experience, it might be interesting to unpack.
So I'm going to start with an easy one, which was I used the double diamond metaphor all the way through the course. And, I had these double diamond models with various annotations on them. And I shared a couple of them in Discord, which provoked really, really strong reactions from people going, "Oh, I hate that. I hate that. That's going to send the wrong message." Um, but I know the talk track in my head. It's going to be an awesome slide. But that process of going, what's the conversation I want to create? What might go wrong? What's going to potentially happen as people apply their own perception filters when they look at it? And how do I, probably in combination with that, when I added words around these things in the slides, was how do I kill half the words so the really important words are the ones that they take away? Um, so it was kind of this kind of blurry combination of all of that, of really putting myself in the seat of the learner when I was making the slide and trying to imagine what was happening in their head, where they might get distracted, and when they look back at their notes a month from now, what are they going to remember? Because I'm not going to be there providing the talk track when they look back at it a month from now. That was the spin cycle that was happening for me.
You hearing a lot of user centricity coming in there, a lot of tuning the message and the voice to what people hear, almost that flipping and empathy and sitting in the classroom and receiving instead of being this from the viewpoint of the speaker.
Well, it was that, if you take it a little bit deeper, and this is a slight sidetrack from the question, but it's been the thought bubble running around in my head because it links to many things. As I process people's reactions to those diagrams in Discord, it's like, I know the talk track, I know it's going to do the right job.
Hmm.
But everybody looked at the slide, and what happened was interesting because different people reacted to different things. And when you talked about it, it was, what did they see? So, we had 4, 5, 6 people who've all been talking a lot over the last few months, who've been sharing ideas with each other, who kind of know where each other are wired. But then you saw the responses, and what you realized was that 5 or 6 people all saw a very different image because they took a not overly complicated image and they added a whole bunch of backstory to the image based on their internal wiring.
Hmm.
And if you take that a little bit deeper, right, because there's nothing startling in that, but if you take it a little bit deeper, then you start to go, models and images are powerful things. That world where you can kind of crystallize an image and go, here's the memorable graphic. It's very powerful when you can do that because it doesn't require thousands of words to explain it. It's more memorable,
Hmm.
but it's also far more subject to interpretation. And in that
I think
graphic, it activates, I think, more things in terms of personal filters.
Well, it almost gets to a question of is something like the double diamond, and I've been working back through the pink sheet process from the thought leader guys, Matt Cook, or Peter Cook. And I wonder something like the double diamond, is that model or metaphor? We treat it as a model, but we use it like a metaphor.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, as soon as you get into people using and consuming metaphors, the whole point of it is that they're telling their own story based on your prompt.
Yeah.
Whereas the model is you want them to see your story based on your prompt.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting when you start to think about some of the things that have been around so long, they've moved from being models to metaphors.
So if you rift, and maybe this is a dangerous rift, but there's a model and a visual that we've spent a lot of years looking at, and it's called the big picture.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And we've had this kind of thread of discussions happening in kind of the chat channels recently about the various misperceptions and misunderstandings that run around the agile community, organizations, so on and so forth, about various stances Safe takes. And, that big picture was such a powerful thing when Safe came out because it said, look, here's just one amazing picture that stitches it all together and shows you the whole thing.
Hmm.
But when you take that lens of people look at a diagram and they tell their own story, and you look around at the various stories people tell when they look at the big picture, there's a really interesting paradigm there.
Is is the big picture our Rorschach test?
Well, I found myself pondering. I was sitting having my coffee and smashed avo on the beach this morning. And as you do, you start thinking about metaphors and philosophy and visuals. And I started playing with the idea of going, what would happen? What would be an interesting thing? Would be to play with doing various kind of fades and blurs over the big picture in terms of where your eye starts and where it travels to,
Ooh,
and perhaps
makes
what's
me.
in focus and out of focus for you at different stages of the journey from a different context.
Well, that would be a presentational one, but now I'm curious. Like, I wonder if Scaled Agile has ever done any eye studies and eye tracking studies on it, like for
It's a really
new
good question.
people. Like, here, I'm a new product owner. I've not heard of Safe. I'm coming to class for the first time in a physical setting. Cool. Sit down at the screen and let me show you this picture. And like, I don't know. I don't. I don't think I'm the test case, but I'm gonna just open it and let's see. Like when it just pops up, it shifted to sideways, but like the green customer and the yellow release train were the two things that hit me most, other than the top and bottom bars. So I like felt the framing, noticed the circles, and then I think my eyes were drawn to the two off-colored things. And I don't mean off palette, but just a little more bright.
I mean,
And
on
I'm
the same
curious, like,
test,
yeah.
I think I'm too programmed. My eyes actually went straight to business agility and then they went flop down to safe principles.
Hmm. So what you're saying is everything in between is just details?
Well, so I have this lens to be honest on the big picture. I have a lens that says the stuff that's really important about safe is the stuff that's around the edges. The safe principles, the core values, the lean agile mindset, continuous learning culture, lean agile leadership, right? The competencies, the principles. And in the beginning, all the stuff in the middle is there to go, here's some practices that help you bring it to life. But the more you use it, the more that your contextualization and tuning of it should be driven by the principles and the actual middle of it should fade out of focus. as you find the best incarnation of the practices and processes for your context. And
I
it's,
play, yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I think that's something I know we've shared and geeked out about many a time, but like with the new UI on the big picture and the intentional separation of panels in 6.0, it almost becomes even more collapsible in some ways. Like I was one of the test pink sheet I sketched out last night just to get my head around how they work again, was driven by the meta model of my creation, and the story comes back to the big picture in a second. And I had like one paragraph abstract and like 3 bullet points and one big question for each of the topics. And my realization is that if I truly understand the material I'm creating, it should be relatively straightforward to zoom in and zoom out.
yeah,
I should be able to take that outline and go into an hour on that topic, or zoom that outline out and distill a pink sheet. And the facility, the fluency one has around navigating those depths is actually analogous to the architect elevator, the ability to work with executives and directors and team members and so on,
yeah,
and the ability to inform, educate, and expand depending on the format. And I started really playing with this like zoom in, zoom out around content. And coming back to the big picture, very much the same thing. I mean, there's a reason we talk about using the overview diagram as the entry point now. It's kind of the important stuff's on the outside. How do you use those capabilities to give better results to your customer and ideally get some value out of it
yeah,
in the process? You look at it in the big picture, and to your point, other than where my eyes go, the important stuff is around the edges. And then you layer in that panel with the human faces, and then you can layer in the pilo practices depending on what level of abstraction you're zoomed at the moment. It's an interesting one to think about ways to teach that and unveil it in some ways.
yeah. Look, I definitely, I know there's some time in the rabbit hole playing with fades, blurs, and transparencies to see what happens when you start to run different filters over the big picture. I reckon there's an interesting little talk on that.
I think I've used that visual metaphor in a couple of my talks over the years. Trying to think if there's any I can pull up and put examples on the Miro real quick. When did I do that? Because I had a couple where I just kind of used transparency to focus different parts of the conversation. I think it was the hidden purpose hierarchy. No, I sliced that one up into different ones. Anyway, probably not worth doing live. So
So,
we
so that was my
go ahead.
distraction from the mindfulness and the influence of my creativity, because it's just, the brain is so just spinning on moments and the underlying meaning for me at the moment. What about you? That kind of the mindfulness and the creativity stuff, you kind of opened it. Do you want to dig a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I think for me it's honestly it's a lot of the persona centricity element. And I do this live naturally as a consultant, I think, of really thinking about who I'm talking to and what is my best approximation of where they're coming from, while knowing and recognizing that I'll never have like full connection to who they are and where they're at.
Yeah,
And then using that to expose the portion of the subject matter that is most valuable to them based on that presumption on my part.
yeah,
And don't, this isn't a blank process, of course. There's questions, there's conversation to lead to that, and it's not like, oh, stereotypical product owner. Let me share stereotypical product view. I mean, there might be some of that, but distilling that out of the individual human, almost back to that stereotypical view, to be honest,
yeah,
as part of thinking about content creation and which pieces I want to present and which lens into the content is most valuable. That's new from a content point of view. For the last decade and a half, most of my kind of full polished content creation has been for either Rally, which serves a very broad market, or for Scaled Agile, which serves an incredibly broad market. And now, as I'm building my own program, it's like being opinionated about who my customer is fun, but also like it forces me to put myself very narrowly in a what would this stereotypical narrow individual value. And if I think about a leader who's struggling through change, the message I give for something like, let's take one of the basic ones, like Agile's not a project, and kind of talking about the habit of uh, treating it as something with a start and an end, and that makes it more of an installation and mechanical and blah, blah, blah. Like, you and I could have a 2-hour ramble about that. Which 5 minutes is most important for a director who is engaging on the journey of change to hear? And how much do I assume that they're in a project mindset, or that they've seen a non-project world and they've been in the operational space where everything's continuous? And having to kind of pick anchors along that space is both new, and it drives a different level of creativity, because suddenly by picking that person, I mean, this is Jeff Patton and persona-based thinking, but it's like picking that persona, suddenly I'm having a conversation with that individual through my content. And this is the kind of realization moment, and the kicker in some ways is, and you know what? It's okay if not everybody resonates as a result. And that's the harder one, but
It's
also rewarding.
it's that what I find in that place is it's filtering what's important to them out of what's important to you.
I like
Because
that language.
I find I've got all these things to say, and then it's like, yeah, I want to say them, but you know, there's probably 20 different people interested in the different parts of that, and what's the bit for this moment. Um,
That's I think you just found a good coach filter though,
yeah,
because most agilists have a lot of things they want to say.
well, it's the part, and going back to where you started this, right? In coach mode, I'm laser focused on what they need. Right? It's the hunt. It's sitting there for 20 minutes going, what's the one sentence they need right now?
Hmm.
And maybe there's another sentence they need, but they're not ready for, and I'll add another half sentence to plant a seed for when they are ready for it 6 months from now. That's natural wiring. As soon as I'm writing a PowerPoint deck, I'm writing an article, it's like I just want to say everything. So,
Is this related to the multiple trips to the well attitude? So we talk about iteration and its relationship with business owners or stakeholders, and like if they only get one release, they have to ask for all the things. But if they know they're going to get opportunities every 2 weeks, they tend to narrow in their focus significantly. Is there something related there?
I think I've got to come back because my brain just ran down a completely different path.
Ooh, tell me, tell me, tell me.
Okay. So here's the path my brain. Actually, I'm just going to lower my mic. I'm peaking a bit. The path my brain started to run down was, if you think about the difference between cohort based training and multi day based training, there's an element in which cohort based training allows you to iterate and layer, where multi based training encourages you to jam. You think about, you got people in the room for 2 days. You got 2 days to plan a bunch of stuff.
Hmm.
How much can I jam into their head in 2 days? Because that's what I've got. And they're going to pick up a few key takeaways from it and take that away, and that's it. But if you think in a cohort lens, you can actually iterate the concept, because you can add a layer and you can let them do something with that layer. And then once they've absorbed it and done something with it, they're ready for the next layer.
Hmm.
And so if you think about that, let's say the Jeff Patton, see it work, make it work better again, make it releasable, make it work better if there's still time. When you're in a 2 day context, you don't do any of that. You go, this is the ground I've got to cover, and I've got 2 days, and how much can I get? When you're in a cohort based model, you can go, I'm going to give you a little bit of a concept, and I'm going to let it sit with you. And then the next time we're back, I'm going to give you a little bit more of that concept. So we're not trying to jam huge amounts of information about a concept into one interaction. We're actually allowing it to build naturally over time.
Which aligns with a competency-based view instead of a content-based view.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I'm almost to this point where I'm questioning whether I need special names for inspired agility or versus mechanical agility, or if it's just continuous competency development versus installation.
Yeah.
But I think because there's still a dynamics-based view of how it shows up and the flexibility and the evolution, and there's a lot of other stuff tied in there. But I mean, it really does come down almost to that. Like I can trace it almost back to the beginning of the training cycle. Like if you learn about this thing in a project-centric way, it has a start date and an end date, and it has a certain scope it's supposed to get through.
Yep.
Then how much else falls out of that?
Yeah. I mean, I know that I've had people come to a leading safe for a third time, and I look at them and I go, you poor individual. But then it's amazing how many say, I learn a whole bunch of stuff, right? I came because I was trying to support my people and be there for the conversations they had. And then they come up and they go, I saw a lot of stuff I didn't see the first two times. Right? And it was that reality that said they now had a basis on which to anchor it. But it's pretty inefficient going through the whole set of content 3 times. What happens, and I think this is the interesting thing about the way sort of COVID's changed things for us, it's allowed us to do smaller batch interactions because of the virtual nature of it and the lack of logistics of jamming people together in venues and flights and hotels to sit in the 2-day or the 3-day course. But it gives us a lot of different opportunity. I mean, I know as soon as I started cooking on tweaks to the course, I went, well, I built this for in person. I also built it knowing I wanted to take it virtual. But one of the things that I started to think was not just do I take it virtual, but do I chop it and deliver it with a kind of layered approach of here's the first piece, now go and apply that to your thinking and your work for a week or two, and now here's the second piece. And is that actually going to produce a significantly better learning outcome?
If I think, at risk of getting into course design, one of the things I was playing with in the last couple of weeks, and I think I did a coach on the couch on it, but I'm not positive, was this idea of a habit-based view of agility. What are the habits and behaviors that need to be recurring in order to unlock the next set of capabilities of Agile?
Yeah.
And it was really me digging into like change in process and how much different do we take on at once, and are we doing Kaizen, Kaikaku, or like this ambiguous semi-scripted Kaizen in the middle? And it's like, can you design that unfolding set of habits?
Yeah.
If you do this first, you'll start to see some benefits, which allow you to start to do this little bit, which then adds this little bit, and then this other piece plugs in. And like, what's the 13-week or the 7 iteration view of Scrum? Do we
Yeah.
do all of Scrum at once, or do you start with, why don't you all agree on what the most important thing is for the next couple of weeks and talk every day? That's your first habit. Done. Nothing else.
Yeah.
And then let's take that big thing and break it down into how we're going to work together for the next 2 weeks at the next 2-week boundary. And you start to build this learning cycle, and suddenly you're doing iterations, one, because it's a 2-week cycle that you've just used from this introduction. You actually retrospective first in some ways. And then you start to just kind of layer in quality practices and behaviors that drive better outcomes. And you could anchor courseware around that, and it almost becomes a choose your own adventure towards like probably module 7. It's like, which of these behaviors are you still most working? Go back 3 steps. You haven't done this yet.
Yeah.
So that could be an interesting like choose your own adventure website design for education. I'll walk the wiki.
Well, the thing that I find really powerful with that stuff is so I'm going to take kind of two swings on that. One swing is this facilitation stuff I've been doing on the weekly facilitation session, which has been very much down this model of here's something new, and initially very gentle, right? Here's something new to start paying attention to. I didn't begin with anything except understand more of what's happening in the room and understand more about what's happening in you. But then what I also had was a weekly, okay, what did you do with last week? And I think that's often
Hmm.
the fear people have with something like Scrum is, if you drip feed it in, you're not going to get the change. Uh, but you need that habit of the reflection cycle. And it's been definitely the reflection cycle as a reinforcement. Oh, yeah, I have been doing it and this good stuff happened. And somebody next to them goes, ah, wow, it was working for you, right? It's not just Mark making things up. Um, but there is that kind of reinforcement. I tried something, it did something for me, it wasn't too scary. And now I'm going to
Hmm.
try the next thing. But what's the role? And this is, I think, where, in a cohort training, it's the role of the facilitator of the training. In a coaching scenario, maybe it's the role of the coach. And it's one of the reasons I enjoy getting people running the improvement cutter is because it sets up a reflective coaching conversation. What steps did you
Hmm.
try this week? What did you learn? What did you learn about yourself? How did that influence the next step you took? Um, you're building that habit of reflection and small steps.
So I'm now picturing a fifth discipline system diagram with a reinforcing loop that is new knowledge, practice, and pulling in a little bit of the rubber band metaphor, the coaches or trainers' view of what good looks like.
Yeah,
Kind of like almost that future vision or future reality anchor being a hybrid of the outcomes and capabilities, but also the practices. And then a counterbalancing loop of the speed of reality and the habits of sliding back and the current context taking over and dragging you back with all of the day-to-day distractions.
yeah,
And it's like if you try to run that first loop at full speed through the 2-day cycle, you get all the knowledge in, but none of the practice.
yeah,
If you run it too slowly, you don't get the knowledge in a timely manner where people see enough impact to energize them and carry them forward.
yeah.
So where's the cycling speed almost becomes a critical question, and then you almost tune that to the you tune that a little bit to the speed of the organization, which at that point you're just getting into coaching a team towards Scrum. I mean, we're just kind of redefining the agile coaching journey for a given team here.
Well, yeah, if Scrum was your target, but that's my
Oh,
other side. That's my other sidetrack tonight. But I'm saving that sidetrack for later.
yeah, that's a good one because it's a landing zone. I mean, you have a vision of what the right thing is, and you have to be willing to let it go, of course. But anyway, but that becomes the important question. Are you iterating towards a set of practices?
Yeah,
Because that's the proven set of things that we know generally tends to get you the benefits you want? Or are you experimentally iterating towards a set of outcomes and trying to pick and choose practices as you go, cookbook style? Like, I hope I have this in the fridge. Let me go check.
which probably boils down to if it's a coach who's the agent of change in the situation, it's a question of whether the coach is guiding you towards practices or outcomes.
Hmm.
Because I think we'd both pretty strongly sit on the fact that if you're coaching someone towards practices, you're probably doing the wrong thing.
So I'm now rewinding to, oh, I can picture the room. I can't picture where that room was. It was a keynote. And it was talking about in the conversation, it was where I learned about Toyota's chief engineer, Pradhan, and the idea of the keepers of the curve, a la the lean machine, and then back into Toyota lore. And I'm wondering if there's a intentional dynamic of setting up as the leader, the director who's responsible for the group having to be the one that is the keeper of the vision. And I have a vision for agility, and that vision is amplifying my results and capabilities so I can achieve this business result. Like
Yeah.
kind of a nice simple A plus B equals C, or A plus B allows C kind of dynamic. And then the coach's role becomes the keeper of the curves.
Yep.
Here is a library of practices that I am an expert at, and my expertise's job is to help introduce which one is most effective for you right now. I have an agenda. It's to help you get better. My
Yep.
agenda is not to arrive at a process destination, and formalize that relationship to some extent.
Yep.
And then that actually gives us something we can test coaches on.
So there's thread one. Do we want to play there anymore, or do we want another bit of fish food in the bowl?
No, it's up to you. You get to pick the next direction now. I anchored that one.
All right, I'm going to pick the next one. And
Okay.
it's a somewhat related but very different bit of fish food. So, in prepping for this course, the two books that basically got complete rereads from me were User Story Mapping and Goiko's 50 Ideas for Better Stories.
And
If
make
you,
sure I
if
know
you,
that one.
it's a really clever little book. I mean, I love Goiko's stuff. He's done so much good things.
Yeah.
Um, and he has some really nice, well illustrated story splitting practices, which are much more useful for people who look at the standard story splitting flow diagram and go, but my stories don't work like that. So I've been kind of flip flopping between the two, and it's interesting, kind of the refreshers you get when you do that. But one of the things that Goiko really gets stuck into is the fact that our push for smaller and smaller stories framed around sprint boundaries has taken us away from the first essence of stories. And his argument that actually your slice should always be valuable to a user and shippable,
Hmm.
which, if you go and play Elephant Carpaccio, is also the dynamic there, right? Every slice should be shippable because there should
Hmm.
be some user scenario where they can get value from that slice. And then if I go a little bit further, I find with most arts in early life that fundamentally they waterfall their features. You say you've got user stories and enablers, and then you look at their backlogs, and their backlogs don't have a lot of user stories, and they do have a lot of tasky looking enablers.
Hmm.
And, the pragmatic bit of me says the world doesn't change overnight. You start collaborating, you start sort of moving down the journey, and what you hope is the balance of what actually smells like a decent user story in your backlog gets higher, and the balance of what looks like a waterfall lifecycle in your backlog gets smaller.
Yep.
And it just journeying. And you just kind of hope the train doesn't get stuck. The challenge I find for a lot of people is the thing that they do pragmatically to help them get started then just becomes ingrained.
So to learn,
And sorry, go on.
we're getting into training wheels here.
Well, it's the training wheels they never take off. But if you think
Hmm.
about some of the impacts of that, it's like, well, if you're doing that, what's the product owner's role in the backlog? And what do acceptance criteria look like for a task? And what are the other habits that you're not building as long as your backlog's full of things that really aren't user stories? And how many good habits does a pragmatic slice things into bits of work that fit into 2 week cycles impede along the way? And, Goiko's stance in the book was, well, if you've got to break the user story to fit inside the 2 week cycle, don't fit inside the 2 week cycle.
Hmm. There's a controversial statement.
Which, of course, if you're kind of Kanban-y, is no surprise because
Hmm.
what do I see? I've seen a lot of trains try is they go, let's go for smaller and smaller features because foundationally all you're doing is shrinking the batch size of feedback, right? But you shrink to smaller and smaller features that has its own ramifications, and you still wind up in this thing that says, oh, we get better flow if we put smaller features through the system because we waterfall the features. And you're not getting the good iterative flow of feedback inside the features as long as you waterfall the features. And I started to ask myself, is my stance all these years that I'm just being pragmatic, not necessarily the right one? And would it be more productive to chase better sliced user stories, even if they're still big, because it ingrains the habit of iteration?
Hmm. So I went down a metaphor path first on this as you were talking. And the metaphor I used was, what's the different way? Like before asking a better or worse conversation, what's a different path? And the metaphor I used is, okay, so we talked about training wheels, but the other style of teaching somebody to ride a bike is to use the pedalless two-wheeler thing and learn balance first by just pushing yourself along with your feet and never using training wheels, never having that crutch.
Yeah.
So we get this. Maybe it's because of the invest and S being not being small enough or sized appropriately. It became small for a
Yeah.
long time for a lot of people,
Yeah.
and the push towards 1, 2, and 3 day stories that a lot of people have taught, and I've taught and heard and many times. And
I've taught it too.
if yeah, and if you're gonna get to the DevOps 24-hour learning cycle, then you kind of have to get down to that level eventually.
Yeah.
But and then I look, okay, what's the different path? And I think about the number of times during release train scale conversations, and call it PI planning, call it pre-PI planning, where it blurs across the event boundaries. But this idea that 8 and 13 point stories are the right size stories. And before I get too close to something, all I really want is a smear of what you're trying to learn and achieve, and really focus on that value progression first.
Yeah.
And when I get to that, I don't think of it in terms of splitting stories. I think of it as, what are the meaningful chunks of a feature? I don't use story language yet. Like my first pass of story decomposition is, write me some bullet points about what this feature needs to have in it that you could potentially do separately, individually.
Yeah.
I don't use story language. I don't use as a I want so that. I use, tell me what the chunks are of things you got to go spend money on doing in order to achieve the value of this feature. And so I start with, when you're talking, I kept running down that path. What's the non-story path to splitting stories? What if I purely keep it in the value conversation? What are we trying to achieve? And make it more of a brainstorming of activities instead of trying to slice value smaller and smaller and smaller. It's like, well, let's start with this idea of decomposition for purposes of flow,
So,
and go down that path. What do you want to learn out of this?
well, that's been for me, and it's what I wound up really focusing on in the course was slice for feedback,
Hmm.
right? And I was sitting in this lens of, there's three types of feedback you're interested in: desirability, viability, and feasibility. And know, any slice of a user story that generates you feedback through one of those lenses is probably a good slice.
Would closing a dependency loop be a viability feedback?
Absolutely.
Okay. I was just trying to categorize, like, but what about dependencies? I guess they go
Yeah.
in viability.
It's I, I think if you look at that world, what it means is you're going to have a lot more Kanban teams.
Yeah, that's a tough one for me, because for me, every team is a Kanban team. They just might happen to use 2 week reporting windows.
Yeah, but I mean that's just Kanban's Kanban, right?
Hmm.
And the so if you think about running, if you set a law that says as soon as you've got to the smallest possible thing that actually generates meaningful feedback, stop. Even if it's not 8 or 13, even if it doesn't neatly fit in a 2-week chunk, right? Stop there and run a life cycle that actually allows you to achieve shared focus on iterating towards your solution.
And this is where I don't actually see any disconnect with what you're saying and how I've operated Scrum, because there's a pivot point in value decomposition where you are kind of tipping into solution decomposition and keep going to the size that allows you to iterate your solution rapidly in pursuit of getting that value piece. And this is where I think our habits of demonizing tasking may have actually come back to harm the development of teams. It's like, cool, you've got the value chunk small enough, sized appropriately to learn something. Now break that down into work packages that are smaller than 2 weeks and keep going until you get to how you're going to work together as a team to deliver this thing. Not in a scripted plan all the way through detailed project plan mode, but in a cool, you've got a value package now. What are the 5 interfaces you need to build? What are the 2 screens that go on it? How do you need to wire this into your infrastructure? What's your deployment steps? And now you've got 27 things you've got to do to get that feedback. Those become your cards. Get started. Work together on them.
So if you take that and you go, and I'm going to sit with that for a minute, right?
Hmm.
What you're fundamentally doing is you're doing the kind of classic Scrum sprint backlog of tasks is fine because it's fed by user stories.
Hmm.
And the very good guidance that Scrum would give is if you're tasking and you've got a sprint backlog full of tasks, you just don't task more than one sprint at a time.
Sure.
Uh, so if you acknowledge this notion that says, and I've got a backlog of user stories, and then I've got a sprint backlog of tasks, which is the kind of next decomp below the smallest I can get my real user stories. That works fine. And we all know the perils you've got to watch out for there in terms of the fact that
Yep.
you don't want a team to be focusing on finishing tasks. You want a team to be focusing on finishing stories. But it creates an interesting dynamic in terms of PR planning
Hmm.
because you're no longer filling up sprints of PR planning
You're
because
taking those
otherwise
bigger You're
well,
taking those bigger things and kind of leafing them across, and you're probably highlighting which of those tasks enable dependencies to resolve and go faster, and so on.
so you're doing rough drops of what sprints do you expect stories to finish in. You wouldn't be
Hmm.
tasking in PR planning though.
Well, but let's get tied on what we mean by tasking. Like, if you're talking tasking in a thing that's small enough to estimate in hours and coordinate around in a daily stand-up, then no, you're not. And I hardly ever do that. But if you're talking, I've got a 13-point story that I'm roughly loading no more than 2 stories per iteration given the size of my team, but I need to break a couple of these down better to resolve dependencies for other teams, and I can drop those 2-day tasks, 3-day tasks into the rough iteration where I think they're likely to fall without having to completely do all of the tasks, then that starts to feel a lot more healthy.
So what's the challenge there in terms of people's ability to apply that nuance?
Um, I actually haven't seen people be challenged by that if you don't load them up with all the agile rhetoric about the other stuff. The people that struggled most with that advice, in my experience, are the ones who had a lot of agile learning, whether or not they had a lot of agile experience. Um, the risk factor there, but there are some real risks there, is that it does drive you towards feature factory as a destination as opposed to a transient path on the way to something better.
Yeah.
Um, and it can risk never learning how to slice value smaller, which I don't want to lose that as a goal because that's your feedback cycle and that's where you get the market validation 2 out of your 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
But as far as unblocking a group that is struggling to deliver, which is often the first problem I used to run into, all their agile rhetoric didn't help them until they learned how to actually get something out the door. And we could force them to beat their head against finding that breakthrough of shrinking the thing to the small enough level they could actually all do it, or we could help them get better at, let's call it agile project management for a minute to learn the delivery skills, and then they can use that to get to the next level of delivery of better things. So I didn't actually find a lot of issue with that except with Agilists because they saw it as a step backwards, even though it was far better than where the group they were working with
Well,
right
I mean,
now was.
going back to being pragmatic, I've always felt it's better to be pragmatic. Like, what I hate is a pristine backlog full of user stories that have got nothing to do with the way the team's working.
Hmm.
But boy, have I seen that a lot of times. You say, show me your backlog, and it's like, oh, that looks really nice, well sliced, all valuable. Then you go, let's talk to me about what you're working on and which stories it relates to. It's like, no, the stories are the things that somebody maintains to keep management happy. This is the way we work.
Hmm.
So there's a
Yeah.
linkage that's great in terms of being pragmatic. The question that I always run to is, you can coach people through that and make sure they don't get stuck and they keep leaning into smaller stories. And I'll always say tasks are training wheels. You might need them for a bit, and then you drop them.
Hmm.
Uh, but have they got access to the people who can help them take that journey, or are they just likely to go, well, this is the way we interpret agile at our place?
Maybe I want to go a different direction though, because there's a nuance here that I think is part of it's a key part of the education and the mindset that changes whether it works or not. I realized, and then I was influenced on this one. Oh wow, It's gonna be back into like the 2011 era probably. Maybe earlier. It's a session by James Shore and Arlo Belshi, Promiscuous Programming. And one of the side conversation, this isn't even the point of their thing. It was just a flip chart, and they made a point of this idea of the programmer's notebook. And it's almost a substitute for design documentation and work planning documentation. And my concept for this is no longer any clue if it's their concept, by the way. At this point, it's long enough for history. Is that for anything, any work, maybe it's at the size of the value release and the smallest valuable item that you talk about. But for any item, there's a tipping point between when the artifact is for someone else and when it's for the team.
Yes.
And for me, tasking is that point of transition. This is when the story has meaning to others. It is for a purpose, and others will rely on the description and the value it's providing, and it will help them coordinate their activities. When you move anything smaller than a story, it's not about size for me. It's about for us versus for others. And I have always taught tasks as this is your space as a team to figure out how you need to work together and what you treat it like a notebook. If you move tasks around, if you resize them, if you shuffle them, nobody outside the team should even notice, much less care. It's your
Yes, I've,
notebook.
I've definitely done that. Back in the days
And
before we were all virtual, I used to go, if tasks are helpful, just whatever you do, don't put them in your tool. Keep them as
yeah, what
post-its.
actually say put them in the tool so you can work together. But I then coached everybody around the team. If you look at these, you're doing it wrong. But same idea. Um, but if I start to think down that path, that's where I think a lot of the risks around anything resembling tasking start to come in is when others start to care about your tasks and it's not just a sketchbook. And when I take that sketchbook mindset, then everything else feels safer to me. Like I'm never going to ship my notebook. It's just my place to get ideas out. My pink sheets are 4 up on a piece of graph paper because that's the zoom across 4 topics that made sense for me to figure things out.
Yep. So, so let's keep riffing here, right? Imagining that we've got, because funnily enough, this wound up being exactly the scenario that we headed towards in the training this week. If we switch over, and I'll just get Miro, I'm going to argue that you're now winding up introducing a new layer of backlog because you're saying the team backlog is expressed in a fashion that helps the team to collaborate. The user story backlog sits between the team backlog in whatever format that's expressed and the art backlog, which provides you the series of user stories which act as focal points for the contents of the team backlog.
I can't have this conversation without asking what's the lowest level of value delivery in this system as a feature or story.
So I'm going to argue typically for an art, the lowest level of value is a feature until they get good. The lowest level of feedback is a story.
Because I think I'm gonna debate that the moment you treat tasks as a thing with a backlog is the moment that you've created all the negative dynamics around tasks, as opposed to tasks as uh, a design artifact of how we're working together.
So when a team decomps a bunch of stories into things that smell like tasks at PI planning to enable them to break dependencies and get their head around how they're going to work together, what are you calling, where are you putting those post-its?
Um, I hate to say this, but that's a if it depends category. And I'm going to see if I can get you an example of a way I've done it real quick. No, Google, I don't need Black Friday details. Canonical design, uh, uh, software system design diagram. Sorry, I'm just trying to get a generic picture that is complicated enough to be interesting. Perfect. I have no clue what domain this is in, but I'm going to say it's perfect. So if I've got a picture that looks like this,
Yep.
and it looks like this is a order system, classic. Oh, it's out of the MDM Blueprint Part 3 for Applied Enterprise Architecture, just to give a credit for credit's due. I have literally said my tasks in various points are of this format. Here's task 1. Oops, I need a bigger, let me get a slightly better marking tool for this. Thickness, there we go. So here's task 1, here's task 2, here's task 3, here's task 4, here's task 5, and oh, by the way, let's also print out a UI sheet and highlight a couple things for task 6 and 7. That sometimes I don't even use post-it notes because this has more meaning with the team.
Mm-hmm.
Back at IncuBook, we had things on the board, and this was years ago. This was actually my first non-local conference talk diagram that I pasted below. But we would literally print out chunks of the system, sketch in the new pieces, and that became her backlog for the story, quote unquote. We did an FDA regulated device, and my job before that, we talked about Agile, but we weren't trying to formalize any Agile process. It was loosely probably most modeled on feature-driven development back then. But we had a design memo at the beginning of every little chunk of work, and it was the smallest piece of feedback work. And we sketched out a design memo, and page 1 was what the UI would look like, changes sketched up. Page 2 was what the system design would look like, changes sketched up. Page 3 was any interesting regulatory or other concerns that we had to add. And we had a stack of a paper box full of those by the end. That was our design history memo.
So,
and the regulators loved it.
so I'll be honest, I look at that and I go, nothing there tells me that they're not legitimate user stories, the slices you've drawn. But they generate
They
feedback.
don't. Maybe.
They
I'm
generate.
not too. I didn't worry about it that much back then. I was worried
No,
about whether they
and
helped the team get to its goal.
and you wouldn't have, right? But they're all legitimate. I'm going to design, build, and test something that produces feedback that can be validated and functionally tested, right? Would you bother to putting in an as I want so that? Well, to be honest, I don't bother putting in an as I want so that a lot of the time anyway. I
Yeah,
care about it.
honestly, the scale of this in my mind, each of those circles is probably in the task level, not the user story level, because it didn't really have any visible feedback or value to users until the collection of it was done.
Yeah.
And it would all be done by developers within one team.
Okay. So I see order management interacting with billing and production, inventory, and shipping, and I go, we're in big land.
This is the danger. This is the danger of grabbing a random example in a corporate
Right,
system. Like, to me, this is a week's worth of changes to a handful of tables and a couple new stuff on UI.
right. So in that case, yeah, it's just stuff you got to do to get the story done. But let
But
me,
I'll highlight that contextualization we just did to align models.
yeah,
When the risk of a
but
picture here.
back to our early conversation, right?
Hmm.
Um, so let me play a little bit more because I'm going to talk about the other dysfunctions of backlogs full of tasks disguised as enablers for a second.
Oops, I lost a task when I moved that out of the way.
That's all right. It's a nice little squiggle.
Just Post-it notes fell off the board.
Right? Because if you think about, a user story should have acceptance criteria, the product owner should be able to accept it, it should meet the definition of done.
Hmm.
And I see a lot of teams that start with very tasky backlogs full of enablers
Sure.
struggle to make definition of done meaningful because definition of done tends to be oriented towards something that smells more like a legitimate user story and not so much to a task. Um, and likewise, how does a product owner write good acceptance criteria? How does a product owner process acceptance? Right? They all tend to sit in the kind of user story space. So if you've got a team that is struggling to get and just to get good user stories that will give you a feedback and, look and smell like a decent story, and they're struggling to get them down to kind of smaller than a sprint chunks or the right size chunks, and they need another layer in order to be able
Hmm.
to sanity check their plan, right? Because I think so much about what you're doing in a PR planning and smearing stuff across sprints is to generate enough conversation to be able to go, there's some numbers and they might be story points and velocity, but irrespective of the numbers, as a team, we've had a rich enough conversation over the course of time to go, this feels doable, right? And we know the bits that are going to be important about how we interact with other teams.
Hmm.
And when the stories are still kind of big and chunky because they haven't yet hit the point where they could slice them without compromising them, they are going to wind up putting a whole bunch of lower level stuff in their PI plan to reach that comfort level. And so either
Yes.
you're gonna mix metaphors in the same backlog and go, we've got a whole bunch of these other things sitting in our notional backlog next to our user stories that they're actually meant to add up to, or something crazy.
And that matters because.
So if you know that this team backlog box, right, something that you're kind of using for the moment because you need it for the moment. Right? My experience with it has been as teams get better at working in a way and their architecture evolves to support them working in a way that they're sliding nice small stories through pretty regularly, then you don't really need the tasky stuff anymore
Hmm.
because the stories by nature are smaller, therefore you don't need that extra level of decomp. But you live in that kind of bridging state between the two. And the reality is the typical enterprise agile team in a scaled environment ain't like the dev teams I used to work on. It ain't like the dev teams you used to work on.
Probably true. Completely true, to be honest.
What worked for us isn't necessarily going to work for them. And they can feel very fearful and they can really struggle with letting go of not being able to see all this detail about what they're actually going to be doing in between it adding up to this meaningful thing called a user story.
The more we talk about this, more I am finding myself in this world of wondering, like, why the heck do we do user stories in the first place? um, and with a little bit of basis, and I'm going to explore this from a provocative point of view, not from a advisory point of view. Um, but I start to think about, okay, so if the feature is the valuable thing we're trying to achieve, are what we really so the thing in the backdrop on me for me in this is in my career I have seen extreme user story deflation,
Yep.
to the point that even I mean I used to do feature driven development, and those features were not much bigger than the scale of a user story, and what, as I understand it from early Scrum and kind of the early Cone days and so on, where a team of developers might have a couple stories per month long sprint. Like it was just a thing to anchor and tell the story of what they were trying to achieve, so it made sense to people and was focused on the outside world.
Yep.
And if you take that average story is a 5-person team times 30 or 20 working days, 100-person days, down to an average story as a pair working for a day. And we're talking like a 25-to-1 reduction in scale here,
Yep.
to the point that features are the new story. And what we put on the backlog as features, because I don't know any release trains that use that 10 features per PI attitude, they use like 50 or 100. Everything is too small to make sense of and have conversations around. So if I start to zoom in on that, I'm like, well, now we have a larger set of PI vision and objectives slash product briefing slash slightly unnamed thing in SAFe that I usually end up with a handful of capabilities, even for an art backlog, just to make sense of
Yep.
what's in it. And features that in an ideal architectural world could easily fit into one team and be done in a week or two, but because of the virtue of our enterprise environment require many teams and a lot of different components to build up to,
Yep.
for better or worse, because there's some actually really good architectural elements that lead to that now. Um, Maybe what we're actually saying is teams are doing tasking, period. And over time, their tasks become more end-to-end value aligned and more valuable slices.
So, I'm going to take I'm going to riff on that for a minute, right? Because if you take that notion of the average art taking in 50 small features,
Hmm.
right?
And is that something you see as well? It's worth
Oh,
validating because,
oh yeah, absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely, right. And if you think about the purpose, because I always anchor back to I want strategy to unfold,
Hmm.
right? I
Yep.
have a simple metaphor and I've had it for a lot of years, which is a feature is something that you should be able to go to a senior executive and say, we just shipped feature X, and they'll be able to recognize it and go, that's great, right?
Yep.
And if you've chopped it down to the point where you're feeding 50 tiny features into an art for a PI, you've probably broken that communication, right? And you've wound up going from, a massive decomp magnitude going from your epic to your feature, and the feature's no longer serving the purpose of communicating the steps towards the overall vision,
Hmm.
right? Now, why do you see it? I know why I think we see it. I think we see it because teams are waterfalling features. And the only way to deal with the risk factors involved in teams waterfalling features is to write really small features.
I see, I can argue some other ones, but I could probably then track them back to that. So sure.
Right? Because they like them small because they know that when their features are big, they blow up and they slip across the PI boundary.
Hmm.
Um, there's one. There's another one that says they write them small because for some reason they try and contain features to component squad boundaries, and then you have to add up multiple features to get something interesting. And yeah, there's various
Hmm.
reasons, but an awful lot of them are driven by the team's waterfall of feature. Um, so we'll make small features, and there's a reality that says that could be a valuable thing. You could just go small features driving small batch value flow, right?
Hmm.
The
If
question to me,
if they're actually valuable.
well, assuming they're valuable, right?
Yep.
Assuming that they're small features, but they're still valuable. The question for me is the difference between iteration and iterative and incremental,
Hmm.
right? because I tend to like to think most of the time a feature is shippable, right? And that's my pragmatic trade-off to go, yes, I know a good high maturity team with a high maturity architecture, they're, only shipping at the end of a feature is very slow, but for most trains it's a good target point.
It's an upgrade.
Right.
Like that's progress.
But if shipping is the incremental thing, to me, the whole point of stories is the iterative thing, right? I'm going to get a little bit, and Goiko uses the term, it's a survivable experiment, right? How far am I potentially going to go down the wrong path? And the notion that says when I finish a story, I can get feedback that tells me whether I'm going in the right direction, and preferably that feedback's from a user. Sometimes it's feasibility feedback, sometimes it's viability feedback. But the iteration should yield feedback, and I should iterate towards the features that I ship. And for me, that's the purpose of the user story, is to drive the iterative mindset.
Can't really argue with that. Because if it actually I think it matches with how I actually think about it too. One of the ones I played with, and this has been a few years, but it was really effective when I was using it for the companies I was using it with, different, not huge enterprises in this case.
Yeah.
Is my verbal description was features are the things in your marketing plan, stories are the things on your release notes.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of getting to that same attitude. And it didn't really encompass like experimental stories and the user research spikes that actually involved deploying software and things like that back at the time.
Yeah.
But I think the attitude still fits pretty well. Because one of the other test cases I do for funsies now and then is ask a business owner, so kind of that sufficiently executive role that cares about the business outcomes,
Yeah.
to stand in front of the PI board, in front of the swim lanes, and look at it and absorb, and then I say, okay, close your eyes, don't look at the board anymore. You're about to spend $2.5 million over the next month or two.
Yep.
What are you getting for it? And I just write down what they say.
Yep.
And I'm like, that if I don't see that in the PI objectives when they roll up, we screwed up.
Yeah.
And if I can't read the features and make out that list of things that came out of their mind when they think about what they're buying for $2.5 million, then they're not factored well.
Yeah.
And that's a variation of the business value assignment, only it's more of a coaching moment version of it for me. It's
Yeah.
at the whole art level.
Yeah.
And this, I think I'm actually convincing myself that this deflationary attitude towards stories is harming us and our ability to be anything other than a feature factory.
Yeah.
So maybe that's where I've ended up with this hour of conversation.
I think we've lost too much sight of the Mona Lisa picture at the story level. There's such a good conversation driving there in terms of the kind of anti-patterns that exist, and why is it? Because there's a reality that says a lot of people will say why, right? Why do we chop work up like this? It's inefficient, blah blah blah. The prevalence of coaches who were never technical, and scrum masters who have never delivered software, and the ability to lead technical people down the path of going, what if, right? Losing, and for me, it's probably the two threads of this are iterating with stories gets me the feedback that steers me. But the other one is it lets me flex the scope, because if I've iterated my stories and I've actually built up using good user stories, then when things change, I can take the new stories in, I can drop the existing stories out, right? I can flex the in and outline, and I can survive it. If I've waterfalled the feature, I can't survive the flex, because, the disruption of a late changing piece of feedback and my ability to acknowledge the feedback is very limited. And
Yes, and I think as I was drawing a picture of similar concept here, because depending on the nature of what those sketches are, and this is where metaphors start to break down a little bit.
yeah,
If I don't need external outside the building feedback to figure out if those first two pictures are the right thing to drive to the next level, then I feel like those first two and maybe even third are ones that I expect the team just to collaborate on and do during planning,
yeah,
not talk about, plan, sketch out, detail into detailed tasks and figure out. Like you got 100 people in the room and they're all together. Get the people that can give that internal feedback. And I just came across an architect that's sitting there sketching out a high level box diagram for a system with 4 VPs in a circle around them, along with 20 team members.
yeah,
And by the end of that conversation, they had enough clarity that they were able to unblock 7 teams across these 4 release trains and just move forward. And it's like that degree of sketch. And the architect was great guy. He was there for years and became a pretty strong leader. He was so uncomfortable sketching in front of a crowd
yeah,
because he was in a corporate environment where millions of dollars of decisions were being made based on every drawing he would generate, that he did not want to share that.
yeah,
He wanted to give that, he needed, because of the scale, to give them like diagram 4 on the left, like here's your box, fill in your picture.
yeah.
And like watching them have that breakthrough and that willing to say, here's the shape of it, now we'll keep talking about the nuance of what's actually on each of these API transitions and which technologies they live in, and like the stuff that he had to have all answered traditionally.
Yeah.
But that was inside the building feedback. That was a how feedback, not a should we do this feedback. And that stuff should just happen in my mind, not be things you script out as having to happen.
Oh, look,
Because otherwise you get the
the,
2 plus 2 plus 2, you get all these other variants.
putting that in there in terms of the amount of times you see PR planning solve those first two sketches,
Hmm.
completely agree, right? It's one of the powers of good PR planning. But it's losing sight of the value of iterating during the PI. That is my
Hmm.
huge concern.
Was there is there a conversation around unnecessary iteration?
Uh, there's definitely a
When do
conversation about unnecessary iteration, but I think the other question, there's a time when you're thinking about iteration, and and I think, for example, the notion of iteration in terms of dependency decomposition is a really good one, right? What iteration maturity of this functionality do I need to unblock a dependency? Might be very different to what iteration of this piece of functionality do I need to be able to ship.
Yep, because I
Uh,
I happened to be flipping through Goiko's card deck because you introduced me to it, and that one jumped out. It's like, how often do we use iteration to solve predictable global constraints
yeah,
instead of just naming them, planning around them, and moving on by making a decision now?
yeah. So I'm just going to steal another.
I really like this deck of cards, and thank you for pointing this at me. I'm gonna
Yeah,
have to absorb it better.
it's a really nice provocation. And what's fun is he's got all these lovely names, right? The reactions you get when you talk about, walking skeletons and dancing skeletons and skeletons on crutches are beautiful.
Hmm.
So just kind of digging in and realizing I'm missing a source here. Um, so putting Goiko and Jeff on the same slide, the Goiko quote, right? The world shouldn't end just because the story turns out to be wrong. Stories are based on assumptions, and those assumptions might turn out to be right or wrong. Um, how much do you want to invest in learning whether it's going to work and enable the user to fulfill their desire? So there's lens one. Then there's kind of lens two, which is the Jeff Patton, his 4 phase mindset. See it
Hmm.
work, make it better, make it releasable, enhance it if there's still time.
Yep.
And I think for me, this is the other aspect of iteration, which is there's learning-based iteration and enrichment-based iteration.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Like that.
enrichment-based iteration forces the convergence points that give you optionality.
The enrichment-based forces convergence points that give you optionality. So by getting things that you can see working and are better enough to actually evaluate, that's when you start to decide which design options to pursue for the actual refinement.
Yeah.
Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
You're speaking Reinert's in there for a second.
Sorry, I slipped into I'm just chatting to Eric mode. I forgot that. I forgot hopefully somebody's following this conversation.
Well, it's fine, but even it's not even about that. I have to slow down to parse Reinert's, so it's a very dense, effective language for it's a compression algorithm.
Yeah. Let's go simpler, right? Which bells and whistles have we got time for? Right? If you've built iteratively, you get to make the choice about bells and whistles. If you've built with the kind of, polished Mona Lisa approach, you've got no choices about bells and whistles because you've already built the bells and whistles by the time that you need to make a decision.
Yep. And I'm going to broaden that. It's not just what do we have time for. It's now that we see the thing, which one do we actually want?
Yeah.
And that again doesn't have to be external.
Yeah.
It's better if it is. A/B test, put it out there, experimental models, multivariate testing, wonderful library of techniques.
Yeah.
But sometimes even just I've got it working, it's on the screen. Now let the product person, whether you're product owner, product manager, whatever, take a glance and let their hunch take over because they know their market and their customers
Yeah.
better than the developer,
Yeah.
better than they did, better than they did when they were guessing a month ago.
Yeah. The other one
And,
sorry, go on.
but let me flip this around then. If we go back to our story conversation, instead of saying, like, I think we hide a lot of it under the terms, but what if we flipped it around and said, the goal of the story is to get it to the point that I can take a look and decide what the right bells and whistles are.
Yeah,
And instead of calling that MVP or some other variant of language, MMF, whatever, actually sketch that out in the backlog. Hey, we got a predictable lifestyle. Here's a life cycle. Here's a new thing. Call it a feature. And at a point during that feature, we know we will want to then take a look at it and understand a finer grained view as to what we want to release. What do we need to get to that point? And actually make that a design target in our tasking.
it's and maybe I'm going to go back to big words again, but if you think about a story as a convergence point, right? So the moment you go to task, to me, what you're doing is you're branching your activity, right? I'm building this bit, I'm building that bit, I'm building that bit, right? And then at some point, it's time for merge conflict resolution and feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And
Assuming different people are doing the tasks. I
yeah,
want to highlight that. There's an assumption hiding in there.
yep. Even sometimes when it's the same person doing the tasks.
Sometimes.
But that moment that says, where's the convergence point where I can make an assessment? And again, I come back to the feedback-based assessment, right? I can adopt the hat of I'm looking through desirability, feasibility, or viability. And while you process and respond to that, looks like Yuval's listening. I'm just seeing he has popped us a comment through. He's got the S curve to talk about it. Learn early on, main bay up the curve, enrich until diminishing returns or losing compared to stuff from the next feature, right? Which is kind of the conversation we've just had. Maybe he typed it while we were busy arguing with each other and we missed it until we'd had the same conversation.
Seems like something we would do.
So, yeah, one way or the other, I think it's certainly this reflection pass has put a fresh spin in my head around trade-offs about task-based backlogs and driving out convergence points and accepting that, stories that are really just coarse-grained breakdowns of features to find those convergence points, but putting them in for real is a useful thing. The other thing I think that's there, and this probably comes back to that moment of the potential intervening backlog. The the other question is, if depending on your team composition, you might have your teams broken up such that it's difficult to get convergence points in a team's backlog. Um, and if you think about a user story as driving a convergence point as a kind of interim state where you might evaluate or iterate or whatever the case might be on your path to a feature, there's a world in which that potentially has to span teams.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the truth is the group I was teaching it to this week are a very tuned interpretation of life, and they've gone down this path, and this was kind of one of the real moments for them was to go. They started with product owners associated with teams. They've actually moved to product owners associated with products. Um, as part of that shift to trying to get really product centric user story and ownership in their product owners, and leveraging this idea of the user story as being the shared focal point between the teams. A little bit more less style, although of course less is going to say that they all have to be feature teams. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's no.
It's great. It's phenomenal when they are.
It is, and
That's the
there
point.
there is no possible future for this particular organisation where they're all feature teams, given the number of highly specialised PhDs they've got.
Yep.
So
I sketched out a couple a slightly different view below. I'm not sure you're not
let,
sharing
let,
right
let
now.
me let me take a look. Where we got? All right. So I'm zoomed on your first one.
Yeah, and then just maybe both of them top bottom, or I can move them left right. But I think we
Let
get
me
this.
go left, right.
I'm gonna move them. I'm gonna move them left right so they're
Yeah, cool.
easier to see both. Um, I think we're often in a mode where we live on the left, where it's like, okay, once you have split them, the stories now have their tasks. They're standalone things,
Yeah,
as opposed to maybe a fluid, more dynamic mindset where yes, we have a sketch of the path of the journey. We've told the storyline of this
yeah,
feature. And as we get to various stages along the journey, that story will change based on events. And instead of a container based view of what do we need to have done at the end of this story, I wonder what happens if we pivot it to a front of the next story viewpoint. Okay, so we're working through this. We know we need to converge. I mean, I could sketch a double diamond over the top of this pretty easily.
Yep.
Oh wow, that was horrendous. I'm not sure what I just did with my Miro. There, I lost my shapes because I drug instead of doing it. But if I kind of just vaguely, I'm slaughtering this.
You want a double
Drop
diamond?
a.
I can give you a
I'm
double
just trying
diamond
to.
easily.
I'm just trying to put a diamond.
Okay.
um, there we go. So if I kind of look at it from this point of view of, I need to do a couple of these stories to create the context and the information to expand.
Yeah.
Now, what do I need to have in place to ask myself the questions for this next set of stories that actually is the unlayering of the value? And instead of focusing on the end of the current story, start to focus on the beginning of the next story and being ready for it. And kind of shift that lens so that we stop treating it as a pile of individual things once we've done our decomposition and start looking at it as phases on a landscape to help us get ready for the next step in the journey.
Yeah.
I'm going on a international trip. My first story is getting to the airport in Cabo so that I can then get on a plane and go to my ultimate destination. That's my next story, navigating the airport and flying. And then my third story is getting to the other end. Now, that's not narrow slicing. Each one brings me closer to my destination, so there's value. But that's not kind of our thin vertical slices in any form. But each one is a meaningful value delivery of getting me closer to my ultimate goal. And each one enables the next stage of the journey to happen. So then my story for getting to Cabo is like, okay, I've got 2 stories in my backlog. One involves me driving, one involves me taking the shuttle. I'll
Yeah.
pick which one I'm gonna deliver that morning based on whether the car runs, whether the shuttle's running, or what the weather looks like. And start to look at it as like, here's tools we have to get us to the next phase of the journey. What do we need in place?
So,
And
so,
work back from that.
so if I was, I'm gonna have some fun with that, just because
Yep.
I can't
And then let's make
resist.
this our last topic on a 10-ish minute warning.
All right, kickboxing.
Yep. Time to go get some sweaty exercise in the Melicon.
All right. So picturing in the world that says,
You sort of feel like,
right. So I'd rather do that than your top version. Because your top version is like, I've got a story for driving and a story for catching the shuttle. I'd rather have a story that says, let's figure out the trade off curves that are going to inform my decision in the morning, which fits to your what's ready for the next thing. So I'm going to come out of this. I know the trade off curves about shuttle versus drive. I get to travel to the airport and I travel to the airport based on what I learned in my trade off curves. Because it's one of the things that Jeff pointed out, and he did it really well in user story mapping, is this notion that says, don't have spikes or research stories, have learning stories where acceptance criteria specify the learning outcomes to keep them focused. But then Goiko had this splitting pattern he called learning before earning. And he really expressed it in a way where if you decide you're an Alan Ward geek, what he's suggesting is that you should be thinking about learning stories that potentially involve set-based design and generate the information that enables you to leverage trade-off curves to decide the path forward. And you can use the required data for the trade-off curve as the framing for the story.
so yes,
And
there, there's an unpack there, which is where it becomes more value if you scroll down just slightly. And that is these two things are actually work. And I can't just determine the curves. I might need to do some work to allow those options to exist. And that's where they become different things that I want to track and put some work on.
yep.
In order to be allowed to collapse my curves in the moment of decision. And as soon as you overlay set-based development on this mindset, it's not just determine. It's not just a cognitive exercise in learning. It's a do the pre-work to allow that learning to occur.
But then I'm going to play asteroids with you.
I love this dueling banjo story backlogs, by the way.
It's good fun, isn't it? Here's my response. Split the story when you get there.
So when are we? We should probably contextualize. Are we during PI planning looking at this? Or are we at the beginning of the iteration where I have to drive?
Let's say I'm at PI planning right now. I want this backlog.
Okay. In which case, at PI planning for this, I would have that's my PI planning backlog. I buy the upfront cost international one because that has a cost of delay, and I would know that I need to do some work to travel. I wouldn't decompose it any further than that.
Because then you're in asteroid land here,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
And that might be you or me, but to be honest, a lot of teams would go, actually, we want to think about this a little bit more deeply because we're nervous. At which point, I think we've probably got some reasonable, asteroid busting without breaking them too small. I'm just in love with the asteroid busting metaphor, just maybe because it was such a cool mid-journey picture. But that notion of a team wanting to have a deep enough conversation to feel like they've thought it through.
Well, so here's the thing. I would have this conversation up above during PI planning.
Yep.
I would write down the bottom because by having the conversation at the top, I know enough to say, okay, there's no risks in there. But if I then discover in the conversation that, oh, one of my friends is also flying to Sydney, we're trying to meet up, but we're actually going to both connect through Singapore because we're going to buy those tickets. Sweet. we know we need to coordinate the timing of that. Let me note that because that's a significant dependency with another team.
Yep.
And then the rest of that is travel. And I think maybe that's actually the um, scary bit here for a lot of teams is you can generate knowledge and then leave breadcrumbs to make it cheap to regenerate the knowledge rather than trying to capture all the knowledge and pinning yourself down. And that I think is actually a mastery technique for teams. Instead of trying to write all the requirements, play it through conversationally early, discover where you have issues, and then capture those moments. Write down the important things, but don't try to capture everything and leave it because it will go stale.
Yeah.
And to our point above, like by the time I'm in Mexico, in the time difference between when I bought that international ticket and I'm ready to leave my house to go to the airport, there might be 3 new shuttle services that popped up and one that went out of business.
Yeah.
Like trying to, and I could see teams like trying to put contact Eco Baja and book tickets as a story.
Yeah, and I have a lot of times.
Yeah.
There's a trade-off, right? So
Actually, this is
I look at your
reminding
bottom
me.
one and I go, your bottom one's a really nice, mature team.
Hmm.
My one above it is a less mature team, but a team that's not over specifying, right? Setting themselves up too. And, obviously we probably wouldn't write collapse trade-off curves. We'd pick a route. um,
So it's interesting. You actually we have looped back. One of the earlier streams, I think it was on fifth discipline, I shared my tension-based view to go to the left one first, because there's
the
3
far
now.
left, the one that's just coming.
Yeah, I decided to paste the entire slide deck in reverse order. Um, so I shared this. I shared the left half of this just as part of a side conversation during the earlier stream, fifth discipline,
Yep.
and that you have your needs. It creates tension from where you are to where you want to be in the market. So therefore, you have the stuff you can do, and you need to decide what you need to do to meet those needs. And then based on what you build, you could have additional offers, new additions, new sources of revenue, whatever.
Yep.
Um, going into a feature, I took a complexity-based view of how you build out a given feature. And this is like, wow, this is almost 10 years ago now. I started out on a whiteboard at that company that had the knee bend stock curve, by the way.
Yep.
And where the uncertainty is likely to arise. And this is, I think, the thing that we don't look around the corner and have enough conversation about during planning is where are we likely to see uncertainty from? We can always be surprised. We're never going to be 100% right.
Yep.
But even a average team, I mean, this isn't exceptional maturity level stuff. You can have a conversation and say, what's going to blow up? What's likely to change
Yeah.
that would change our answer here? And that answer to what's likely to change informs how I decompose a feature.
Yeah.
And then the third one is the set of visual patterns for what that looks like. Notice it's all visual for me. So where this lands on essentially the Stacy matrix, it's not, I don't think it's exactly that, but close, then becomes what does it mean for the feature design? Some of them are utterly predictable.
Yeah.
And by utterly, I mean 3 nines, 2 nines. You'll be surprised once in a while, but not often enough to care. So just at that point, just put the feature in, maybe leave some bullet points of the path and move on with it.
Yeah.
Some of it you can mitigate that risk and uncertainty by planning to embed a SME, in which case you need to schedule the feature well enough to know when that SME is going to be available and ask for him.
Yeah.
And that SME might be a technical SME, or we can embed the architect for an iteration or two. Some of them you need to do a little bit of set base, number 4. So sketch out the list of stories visually and know which ones you can cut off. And this is actually where I overplan. What's the scale of things we might need to do so that we've thought through the design space, but know that when we finish orange story number 2 under number 4, that will delete 3 out of the 4 and keep going.
Yeah.
Or you get to a more nuanced, I forget what the reason for number 5 was. Oh, that's the iterative exploration. You're
Yeah.
not just building a foundation in an exploration way and then finishing. You actually need to go through and actively explore the whole time. 6 is pure set based.
Yeah.
we've got a number of different options. We don't know which one we want to release, so let's build them all because cost of delay is too high. And number 7 is lean startup, where you do a whole bunch of shit and then you start over with a pivot and nail it on the first time.
Which really aligns to, and Goiko makes a comment in 50 Quick Ideas. He says, if you know the answer, iteration's a waste of time, right?
Yeah.
But then Ward says, we're often delusional in our perception that we know the answer.
And that's where I look at a conversation of where's the source of change likely to come.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest takeaway I have from this whole conversation, maybe this is moving into our wrap, is paying attention to the context in which a team is operating
Yeah.
drives the approach that is appropriate for every one of these things.
Yeah.
And whether that's the uncertainty landscape, whether that's the dependency landscape, whether that's the relationship with your stakeholders and the upstream landscape, I think the landscape in which you are trying to do this defines the right answer in almost every case. The team's maturity plays into it, but honestly, I don't think that's the main thing. An immature team is just one that doesn't know which parts of the landscape to pay attention to yet.
Yeah, I think I'm going to agree to differ with you about that last bit. I think the team's maturity plays a huge factor. But completely agree with you on know the landscape and not think it's one answer for all. But I think there's another layer that would be interesting in another conversation to say what are the risks inherent in each choice you might make.
Mm-hmm.
Which has been the thing that I think was the attentional piece for me as I reread the Goiko stuff, was I went, what are the other things that have been the consequences of some of the pragmatic calls that I've made when I've been coaching?
Yeah. So if you think about just to share the origin of this diagram that I had shared, is there was a huge debate on story splitting and what the work it needed to be. And as I probed into that, it turned out it was actually a huge debate over the design approach,
Yeah.
not over the stories.
Yeah.
And as I probed into that, I realized it was 2 different sources of uncertainty driving into the system, causing the product leader and the architect to have wildly different opinions about what the sources of uncertainty were, which then led to different design constraints. And as soon as they collapse back to the uncertainty conversation of where were they likely to be wrong, both of them had reciprocal aha moments, and they realized that they needed to operate in a mode that was number 5 in this case. When they're used to, most of the time it's clear feature requests coming against a relatively clear architecture, they were used to operating down in 2 and 3.
No, 2 and 3 are great places if you're a feature factory.
Yeah, well, and 2 and 3 are great places if the features are clear. Not everything has to be explorational. And this is where it's like feature factory isn't a bad thing until the factory can't reconfigure. It's like I don't want 1970s feature factories. I want like 2010 feature factories, but modern manufacturing is pretty damn impressive in its ability to reconfigure outputs on a per request basis.
All right. Let's wrap before we open a new rabbit hole.
I'm looking forward to all those rabbit holes.
They're a lot of fun. I think the dueling pictures was the fun part of the night for me.
Definitely.
It was a shame not to have any of our usual company with us, but it was fun to just go off into craziness land.
What if, out of curiosity, how often does doing the decomposition feel like that dueling pictures we got to do? Because that's what I think what it should feel like much of the time.
Look, it's what it should feel like, but I'll be brutally honest. I usually, by the time that a team gets to the point where they might be doing duels like that, I'm long gone, because my job was to set them on the journey to that point, not to get to stick around and see the really fun bits at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't get to see it very often. The teams that I've seen get to really nice levels of maturity like this they didn't plan at story level. They had average lead times for t-shirt size features, and they whip limited their features, and so PI planning was kind of a non-event for them. Um, they wrote good stories, but it was always just in time breakdowns.
Well, what if? So, anchor thought for a future stream. Back to the metaphor of training worlds versus um, pedalist bicycle.
Yeah.
And I know there's a better name for that, but I can't think of it. Could we treat the exploring like this as the pedalist bicycle and allow the team to ease back to user story creation rather than jumping into this presumption that user stories are the thing we have to build? What if we started with the goal of the team is to yield value? So let's teach teams how to have a dynamic, fluid value conversation, and then later teach them how to pedal the bicycle by writing user stories as a different path to education.
I think
Let's
it's an interesting path to explore.
yeah.
Uh, I I think I'm definitely starting to, and this was the fun in kind of prepping this course, and then teaching this course, and then digging again into the conversation with you is, you know, what's a better way to have a conversation about stories with a team that produces a better outcome in terms of the reason you use them in the first place, right?
hmm Yeah.
um, and what are the framing conversations, and what are then again, what are some of the risks inherent in it?
hmm
So it's been
All
cool.
right. All right. This is a good one. This one's going to yield some further conversations, I think, between us.
Yeah,
So
it's kind
I
of
look
funny,
forward to
right?
those.
It's like, in some ways, it's let's go back 15 years ago to when we were figuring out how this stuff worked. And in other ways, it's like, well, actually, this is every day in terms of the people we help. So,
hmm And 15 years ago, stories were generally created in the context of a single team,
yeah, yeah,
and
exactly.
our context has changed. So
Yeah.
anyway,
All right.
I think I'm going to
Enjoy your
go get some
kickboxing,
exercise.
and I'll see you on the opposite sides of our daylight curves.